Oh, yes, PragerU and Niall Ferguson, please, sit down. I wanted to have a meeting with the two of you to talk a little bit about your recent submission. You know, this video you made about Margaret Thatcher. So I'm glad you came to my office hours, which, you know, might become a series if people like it, or I look at bad history done by large, well-funded institutions like PragerU, and we'll see what you have to say about Margaret Thatcher and maybe where we can find a place in this assignment to find where the history went wrong. So let's just, start the video, shall we?
If you think the world is a mess now, that just means you weren't around in the 1970s. In Britain, where I grew up, the low point was known as the Winter of Discontent, a line borrowed from Shakespeare's Richard III. The inflation rate in 1975 was 27%. The trains were always late, the payphones were always broken, nothing worked. Worst of all were the recurrent strikes. Strikes by coal miners, strikes by dockers, strikes by printers, strikes by refuse collectors, strikes even by gravediggers.
Okie dokie, that was a lot. Why don't we dig into a few points? There was a lot of assumptions in a very short amount of time there. Why don't we begin by talking about how everything was rough in the UK at this time? It is true that the British economy was lagging behind. Several other countries was growing slower than France, than Germany, even Japan. But maybe you should do a little bit more investigation as to why. What did France, Germany, and Japan have that the UK didn't? Well, if you look closely, the governments of these countries sustained and supported the country's industries. But if you look at the UK and you look at the financial institutions, there is much more focus on like short-term gains, immediate stockholder returns, and of course, investing in places that are not the UK. With all that money going out of the country and all of that focus on only what can be gained in a short amount of time, long-term investments like boosting the UK's industries that lead to more strong, well-paying jobs were not doing so great. And so that's why the British economy didn't do so well, because the monetary power in the country wasn't as interested in the country. Now, baked into this early part here, we have a common myth in British history, which is that somehow the massive spike of inflation that happened in the 1970s was somehow linked to the change in union strategy, which caused a significant amount of strikes in the period, and that the pay raises were so out of control that it caused inflation. It's an easy trap to fall into because it's actually a myth perpetuated by the British right. But let's unpack it a little bit and talk about the British economy in the 1970s, shall we? The inflation that you're talking about peaked from the years 1972 to 1976, at which point they started to go down. Now, did that inflation get driven up by increases to wages for public workers, or is it because that around that same time, the UK put in a new law which made a massive deregulation of the banking industry, especially for how much reserve funds they needed to have in order to lend money. So all of a sudden, banks could lend out much larger loans with much fewer reserve money just in case everybody cashed in at the same time, leading to a massive period of banks lending out lots and lots and lots more money. Now, I'm no financial expert, but I do think that there is a word for when a whole bunch of money enters the economy and therefore devalues the value of each individual bit of currency. But yeah, that's inflation, isn't it? Now, normally what you do in this situation is you raise interest rates to slow down a overheated credit market. But the Prime Minister, Edward Heath, decided not to do that, which led to a 14% increase in inflation between 1973 and 1975. With all these financial woes, the banks demanded more deregulation, not less. And then, once the inflation was finally dealt with, they decided to turn around and blame unions for this massive period of financial instability. And of course, still continue to spend their money abroad, causing yet more inflation. Now, next you're going to say that Margaret Thatcher was responsible for fixing the situation, but it was already on the road to being fixed by the late 70s. The Labour government of the late 70s actually managed to halve the inflation rate before Margaret Thatcher even became Prime Minister. And then this period of financial instability was then blamed by conservative governments in the 80s, not on the financial institutions that actually caused the instability, but on unions who are trying to raise their wages. And typically the myth says that these unions were being obstinate, greedy, looking for insane increases in their wages, But there's obviously a lot more to that as well. The strikes that occurred in the 1970s in the UK were legal, they were reasonable, and they were good ideas. First of all, the wage increases that they asked for were pretty reasonable to keep in line with the rise in cost of living. Even that being said, they were willing to work with labor to reel back some of their demands in exchange for some reforms that would decrease the cost of living. I do love how in the 70s and even today now, asking for a pay raise to coincide with inflation and the increased cost of living is considered unreasonable. Like, it's unreasonable to expect your standard of living to not go down year on year. The damage done by the strikes, the various strikes that happened throughout the United Kingdom, were exaggerated by the media in order to help Thatcher. So, given the election that just happened last year, the media helping the Conservatives is not an uncommon occurrence, apparently. And I will tell you a couple things that happened in the UK that did cause major damage to the British economy, and that would be the deindustrialization of the 1980s, done by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and the banking crisis of 2008, which happened because of financial deregulation. Are you noticing a pattern here yet? And these weren't illegal strikes. They were done completely lawfully. They were perfectly within their right to strike. And when they did so, there were several elections and power changed hands without any disruptions. Not to mention the way that you frame the strikes as if that they're just doing this out of the blue, but many of these strikes were reactions to wage cuts or job losses in their respective industries, or they were trying to resist attacks on their collective bargaining power in the 1972 Industrial Relations Act. And they had a good reason, because many companies were not investing in their own companies, they were not doing research, they were not finding new ways to make profits, they were simply laying off employees or cutting wages. Really, the bosses were playing hardball, and the unions had to play hardball in return in order to keep their jobs. And one thing, I want to talk a little bit about the gravedigger thing, because that whole story about the gravedigger union going on strike and bodies being left in the streets and stuff like that is a complete exaggeration. So only 2 cemeteries were shut down, one in London and one in Liverpool. And during that time, while those gravediggers were on strike, the bodies that were supposed to be buried were kept on ice, as is standard procedure. And if you look at other standards of economic health other than GDP growth and inflation, ones that typically the rich look at, and look at ones that have more meaning for the, improvements of everyday life, things like public investment, income inequality, and things like pay and benefits for ordinary workers, 1976 was the best year for the United Kingdom since the Second World War. The 1970s was also when the UK passed an Equal Pay Act for women, as well as the Domestic Violence and Matrimonial Proceedings Act, so both big victories for gender equality in the UK. And of course, the 1970s was a renaissance of British culture. British music was amazing at that point. British art was amazing. It's to call the 1970s a low point or a mess is a great exaggeration. So let's just move forward.
It felt as if there was no way back. And then came Margaret Thatcher. Between May 1979, when she entered 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister, and November 1990, when she stepped down, she changed everything.
Well, you're not wrong about that. All right, we're going to move forward a little bit in the video because there's some sections that are on basically Margaret Thatcher's rise to power. Interesting, and as far as I can tell, not incorrect, but they're kind of, they're just things that happened. They're not really political statements.
The essence of Thatcherism, and it was just the tonic that the patient, the British economy, needed. It's fashionable nowadays to argue that there was no Thatcher miracle in the 1980s. Not only is that demonstrably false, it misses an essential point. Thatcherism wasn't just about raising productivity or creating jobs. Just as important was the goal of defeating inflation and restoring prosperity to the middle class. This it emphatically achieved.
Okay, so now let's actually talk about Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, shall we? The main thing that Margaret Thatcher is known for is completely changing the way the United Kingdom approaches economics, specifically moving away from Keynesian economics, the thing that was growing all of those European governments, and moving towards neoliberal economics, the thing that led the UK and the United States towards a long path towards decay, to a moment we're still in the middle of right now. Neoliberalism is an economic dogma that's focused on privatization and financialization of the entire economy, to leave as much as humanly possible up to the market. You can learn a little bit more about it in a video I did about neoliberalism I released a few weeks ago. I'll put a link somewhere. So what was the immediate effect of Margaret Thatcher coming to power? Well, a massive recession. One of the worst recessions since the Second World War that took years to recover from. And then for the rest of the 80s, economic growth in the UK was not that much different from other European countries. So the deindustrialization and financialization didn't count for much at all. And really, economically, the 80s and the 70s were pretty similar. Inflation, that boogie word that Niall Ferguson keeps bringing up in the video, that was actually higher at the end of Margaret Thatcher's reign than before. But, when Labour was starting to make it go down, but I guess we don't want to talk about that part, do we? And of course, Margaret Thatcher's weakening of unions and deindustrialization led the UK on the path to decay and increase unemployment and created a lot of the economic struggles that many British people are facing today, actually. Britain moved away from manufacturing, which created stable communities filled with high-paying jobs and stable families and stable homes, and moved towards a service economy, which does very well for the financial class in London, but for the rest of the country, it means unstable service work that pays very little, typically has no benefits, and definitely has no union, which means employment protections are barely anything, and longer hours for fewer and fewer pay would become the norm. So if you think that Margaret Thatcher was a successful person by basically destroying the economy of every single part of the United Kingdom that's not London and putting everybody on a long path towards decay and suffering, then sure, yeah, Margaret Thatcher, great success. Woo, big whoop, much great, wow.
The Falklands War against Argentina established her irrevocably in the public mind as the new Britannia, a warrior queen who gloried in victory. And of course, it ensured a Conservative win in the 1983 election. There's no question that sending the Royal Navy Task Force to the South Atlantic took great political courage. Many in her own party pushed for a negotiated settlement. But the lady was not for turning, not because she was nostalgic for the days of empire, but because the invasion was, to her mind, morally and legally wrong.
Oh boy, I did not know people were still defending the Falkland Islands stuff. Holy crap. So as Niall Ferguson dances around, many people in Margaret Thatcher's government, as well as people like Ronald Reagan, thought that it was not a great idea for the UK to start a war with Argentina. Instead, after Argentina invaded the Falklands and took it over because, it's right next to Argentina, many in the international community thought that the UK would, solve this via diplomacy because, that's the sane thing to do. And when you're too bloodthirsty for Ronald Reagan, wow. And looking at this retrospectively, there's a lot of evidence to show that Margaret Thatcher did this not because of actual geopolitical aims or some sort of moral stance, but because she was taking a political hit at home, for all that deregulation and destroying communities that she was doing. So they needed some win. They needed the British to feel rah, 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 ready to what do patriotic British people do? Oh, hate brown people. Okay, so do that again, I guess. I don't know. And also, what's with all this warrior queen Britannia? Niall, I know that you're well known for being an apologist for the British Empire, but the British Empire was not something to be proud of, at all. And in the end, about 904 people died so that you could get a win, so you could go up in the polls. Is that really worth it? So yeah, I guess Margaret Thatcher won a conflict so that she could gain political points that got hundreds of people killed so you can hang on to an island on the other side of the world. It's like you're still the benevolent government that's starving people in Bengal.
Along with her ideological soulmate, US President Ronald Reagan, she was unhesitating in her opposition to the Soviet Union. When the Soviets deployed intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe, she fully supported, despite fierce opposition, Reagan's countermove to send American cruise and Pershing missiles to Western Europe.
Also great to mention Thatcher's hardball with the USSR. Playing chicken with the apocalypse. Always a great idea. The 80s was such a normal and stable time for the Cold War. Later in the video, Niall Ferguson and PragerU claim that Margaret Thatcher was right in predicting that the West would win the Cold War. And sure, yeah, I guess you can technically say that. It was a bit of a win by default.
Default! Woohoo! The two sweetest words in the English language. Default!
But the Cold War didn't end because of some bold Western vision. It ended because of an internal collapse of the Soviet Union brought about by nationalist movements in various countries and a not so great foundation based on all of the expansion done by Stalin. So,
Those of us who stood by her are entitled to feel proud that we were on history's winning side. But we should have no illusions about the humble, supporting roles we played. She was the leader, proof that sometimes it really is a single individual who can change the course of history. In Margaret Thatcher's case, decidedly for the better.
1/5 of British people live in poverty. 1/5! Also, there's a big problem here where Niall Ferguson gets into a particularly outdated theory that he has a particular hard-on for, the great man theory of history. The idea that great heroes that are bestowed with unique greatness are the real shapers of history and have nothing to do with trends, forces, or really any other contextual clues. These people are just naturally better. They have superior intellect. They're strong. This idea is literally from the 19th century, and no historian would take it seriously today. Niall Ferguson, heroes are not how to history, okay? People are products of social conditions. It's more complicated than simple good and bad guy narratives, Niall Ferguson. This take on history is as outdated as Jordan Peterson's take on psychology. It's hundreds of years old. No one takes it seriously, Niall Ferguson. Why do you insist on doing this, Niall Ferguson? What's wrong, Niall Ferguson? All right. We got a little carried away. I do want to have a little chat about you, PragerU, and you, Niall Ferguson, about your behavior as of late. Niall Ferguson, you've been known to be a longtime supporter of British imperialism. You know, the thing that devastated and destroyed a large part of the globe. You defend the British Empire despite the fact of things like the Mau Mau massacre, where they took the entire civilian population of a region and put them in concentration camps and subjected them to brutal rape, torture, and murder. Or, World War II, when there was a mass starvation of the Bengali people. Or how about the over 1,000 that died in the Amritsar massacre? Or the Irish potato famine? Or the slave trade? And Niall Ferguson, you've also had some serious issues with supporting American imperialism, including quoting the poem The White Man's Burden in a positive light. That's not good form. That's some pretty racist shit that you probably shouldn't do, especially if you're a history professor. And yeah, trying to egg on the United States to be more imperialist instead of less is super, super problematic, friend. Then we gotta talk about how you, as a professor at Stanford, tried to hire a research assistant to do oppo research on another student because he was left-wing and trying to take over a conversations initiative. And of course, you've spread the racist conspiracy theories about how the Muslims are taking over Europe, which basically plays into the Great Replacement theory, which, is a racist conspiracy theory, by the way, everybody watching at home. And there's a great video by Sean that I'm going to put in the description that talks a lot about it, so I'm not going to get into it here because it's a whole kettle of fish. You even tried to make the argument that the Roman Empire collapsed because they let in refugees. That's not classy. That's not good, friend. And you, PragerU, oh boy, I have heard so much about you in the past by watching other YouTubers, and holy crap, it's even worse than I thought when I watch it myself. Should mention that PragerU is not a real university, although it pretends to be in a very deceptive fashion, but it is actually a right-wing propaganda firm that is funded primarily by a pair of billionaire brothers who own a fracking company. What bothers me the most about PragerU is the fact that it tries to look like it is an academic site. It tries to look like it has legitimate things you can use for your teaching of classes, but it is poorly researched, deceptively worded propaganda for the right. The fact that the animations are so slick, the fact that it has so much money for advertising, the fact that they advertise on this channel makes me particularly angry at this institution for being one of the greatest sources of the abuse and misinformation spreading on the internet today. And history is important. Look at what this success that the right in the 80s have been able to tell about Keynesianism and powerful labor that leads to us thinking today that nationalizing industries is bad, that public institutions are inefficient and badly managed, and that labor somehow makes things worse for reasons that we can't comprehend. This myth, propped up by people like Margaret Thatcher, have twisted the story of our history to make it think like we're on some teleological path towards this right-wing capitalist monolith, and it makes all of us feel like we're hopeless, like that there's nothing that we can do to make the world better, that things are just going to keep getting worse and keep getting worse and keep getting worse, and that somehow we deserve it. But it's not true. These are myths. These fly in the face of actual history, the history done by historians, which shows a story that there is many places for triumph, for people who work together, for people who fight for economic justice, for people who fight to make the world a better place. And when we forget that these stories exist, when you use suave, silky media like PragerU to try and stamp down the story, to tell us that we can't do things right, that working together as unions is not a good idea, you are responsible for killing the hope of an entire generation. And I'm not going to let that happen. Maybe in the future, I'm going to look at some of this poorly made history done by well-funded organizations that are trying to intentionally change the narrative about how we understand the world in order to advance their right-wing, racist, sexist, homophobic agenda. Because I don't want to let that stand anymore. That's not who I am. And so I think it's about time that I got involved. And I said something once in a while, because obviously this gets me riled up. Don't watch PragerU. F-. Whoo, boy. Oh, that was fun. Is that the word we're going to use for that? If you want to learn more about neoliberalism, I made a video about it recently. You should check it out. On top of that, I also do a Twitch stream on Mondays and Tuesdays that has occasional fun moments. And lastly, of course, I want to thank my wonderful patrons who made this video possible. Thank you, and I'm sorry. See you guys next time for more Step Back.